global investment in education is 300 billion versus healthcare's 3 trillion in 2020. What is the panel's take on this imbalance? They are both relatively the same in terms of global GDP. Philip, you go first and sort of talk about that imbalance a little bit, and what are some of the reasons for that, and maybe some of the ways that you would like to see that change.
I can give you a little bit of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what we're seeing, at least here in the region. I'm not specifically in health tech, but I can tell you in terms of some of the trends. At MAGNiTT, we track all the data. So last year, record amount of capital that was invested in the Middle East, 70 million across 34 deals. We definitely saw in COVID an acceleration of investment capital, specifically in this sector, and I'm sure Badr can speak to that, and as to why, specifically where people are at home needing technologies to kind of drive that. The bit that I find difficult is that when you put that as a percentage of the total amount of capital, I just give you some figures for MENA, for instance. 3.1 billion invested last year in terms of venture capital. Only 5% of that was going to Edtech. Your question is with regards to health tech, but in terms of the wider context, it isn't necessarily top of the agenda of venture capitalists as such, albeit at the top of governments. And I'll leave Rabih to maybe either challenge my thesis or to agree with it, that here in the region, we're seeing that it's already hard to do venture capital. Some VCs are looking for traditional investment that tends to be in any developing ecosystem, transport and logistics, e-commerce, and the current wave being fintech, because there's a clear path to exit with large acquirers that exist globally in markets that are somewhat more mature. When the risk appetite for certain industries and segments, like education, which is very much R&D intensive, less so venture capital intensive, grows, then you begin to see specialization of VC funds, mandates into both education and healthcare. But here in the region and globally, it doesn't seem to be the most chosen industry of choice because the other industries are the first to get disrupted. That's from a data perspective, but I will leave it to the founders and investors to see whether they agree.
Yeah, I see you nodding.
Yeah, first, thank you for having us. It's always a pleasure to be part of such a esteemed group. I'm Rabih, I'm a partner with Middle East Venture Partners. We're one of the leading VC firms in the region, headquartered in the UAE. And we were one of the first investors helping Badr develop his vision at Lamsa. Going back to what Philip said, my job is to give our investors a good return based on the risk we offer them. We don't invent companies. We support people like Badr who have visions in sectors. And historically, we have not seen enough product, if you want, ventures in technology, in EdTech, that were interesting for us to invest in. Specifically in MENA, if you compare to India and China, we don't have enough capital going into technology irrespective of sectors anyway. We're about 1/20th of what India, as a percent of GDP, invests in technology. But as Philip said, EdTech has been a laggard. For a lot of reasons. It's regulated. You have Ministry of Education that have an important role. The companies we look at tend to sell a service not to the user. So, for example, from a consumer perspective, we sell it to a parent, but the user is the child. So that has complications. It's been very difficult. We haven't seen a lot of companies that have been able to penetrate and work from the other side, from the government side, from the school side. It's always been from a consumer perspective, which creates also other issues. But at the end of the day, we need to have enough product created by the venture capital community, by founders like Badr and like the people behind Ustaz, for us to invest in and support. And we haven't seen enough. Also, we invest regionally. Education tends to be different in different countries. We have also a language issue. We have more than half the sector that is public vis-a-vis private, very different constituents, very different requirements. So it's been difficult to find enough product to invest in, but we are ready to invest in. We just announced last week the first close our fourth fund. We just attracted $50 million from outside the region to invest across the sectors. And EdTech is a very important sector, but the least digitized, unfortunately.
So you're saying there aren't enough new
Founders.
innovative companies to sort of look at. What could change that if you were helping to sort of guide an economy?
I'm not, and I don't set policy, but in certain sectors, there has to be a push from the government, maybe some grants to reduce. Remember, entrepreneurs get into businesses that are very risky, and they will focus on sectors where they think they'll be able to sustain, make money, and grow. Education so far has been probably too risky, and maybe the government has a role to come in and put some grants and help a bit, the invisible hand, to try to reduce the risk for some of these entrepreneurs, and help us also. We are private sector investors. Our investment horizon also is a bit short sometimes for some of these long projects, and governments can look at things in a much longer perspective. And we're happy to help because we bring in a lot of skills and key success factors from other industries that can be applied to education.
Badr, how did you do this in an environment where there aren't very many startups in the sort of ed tech sector, not creative and innovative companies? How would you advise entrepreneurs out there who are looking to enter this space and attract good investment?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. First, I'd like to thank and recognize the effort of having this amazing panel, because I think I've been doing the World Government Summit for a few years, and it's the first time that I see the various players of the EdTech ecosystem, sitting on the stage and sharing insights, which is fantastic. So thank you so much. I think it's a big question, and I'll start off by just introducing Lamsa for those that are not familiar with our work. We are MENA's leading EdTech platform for young children. We focus on developing kids in a very important age, which is early childhood education and development. We have impacted the lives of over 20 million children so far, and their parents as well, mothers and fathers, across more than 20 different countries. Now, what was described here is lots of challenges and gaps, but I see lots of opportunities as well. So just to start off and recognize, we have here sitting with us a Minister of Early Childhood, which is an amazing opportunity, one of its first ministers globally that focuses on this segment. So maybe we give her a clap here. And I don't know if this was by design. On my left, we have also Her Excellency Sana, who's leading Early Childhood Authority. So the UAE is also one of the very few countries that developed an entire authority for early childhood. So we also give Her Excellency a clap. So with all these challenges described, we also see massive opportunities represented in this room. I mean, this country is an amazing example of how we're looking at human capital from the earliest of its ages, which is 0 to 6 or 8, depending on how we look at that. Just to take a step back, what are the challenges? I think what the gentleman described were the challenges related to the fragmentation of our ecosystem. It's completely fragmented, I think, when we look at it from a private sector perspective, which results in lots of challenges. So typically we look at a learner, or the way we'd love to look at a learner is from pre-K to grade, right? So that's the span of a learner's life cycle. It's like entire humanity, like from the time someone's born until they have gray hair, they're learning, right? And if we look at that as our real asset, then our calculations of return would be different. Now, from a VC perspective, we salute and thank VCs in the region, including MEVP, that have invested in us early on, knowing that EdTech requires patience versus some of the other industries that Philip talked about. So Philip talked about fintech, about utility, about e-commerce. You can quickly, get returns on that. But what I say is, without EdTech, without proper EdTech, I don't think we can have a long-term vision for anything else. Because if we don't build the right foundation of someone's brain, which is the foundation of society, who is going to use health tech or fintech or anything else if we don't form the right foundation? So add another layer of that, because Rabih mentioned some of the challenges with private versus government, languages. We look at the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA, as one geography. It's many, many different countries. We operate in over 20 different countries and need to look at local laws and frameworks. So I think add another layer of segmenting that. So for example, we focus on early childhood development. So the gents talked about the proportion of investment going towards Edtech in general. I'm not sure if they have the data, but the funding going to and support going towards early childhood development is a very small fraction of that. While we are building, right, just as an example at what I do, we're building the fabric of society. 1 million neural connections are formed per second in that child's brain, forming lifelong learning, behavior, and health. So if we don't tackle that early on, when are we going to do it? It's too late. The brains are wired later on, and we spend much more money fixing. So what I'm saying is, it's very fragmented. And what we had to do as startups is we had to approach it differently, using kind of like a market or an industry development approach rather than a startup approach. And I'd be happy to share more details about that.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from you, Hani, about
Absolutely.
how you approached this task of convincing investors that this is a good space to put your money and not as risky as they might think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, what I want to second everything that was mentioned here. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel. Your Excellencies, your honorable audience, it's a pleasure to be here and discuss a topic that's very dear to my heart. Mental is basically just a bit of an introduction, just to put some context onto what I'm going to say. We are specialized in immersive technology, so we're using engagement and gaming technology as the key to unlock the learner's ability. Myself and my team come from a gaming background, or for decades we were looking at the tools that we were using to engage players into solving puzzles in games, into learning about those fictional locations and characters that don't have real value in life. And the genesis of creating Mental was to look at that opportunity of how can we use the DNA of gaming, both as a technology and also as a game design theory, into creating a platform for learning through simulations or learning by doing. So it's a big challenge, and there's a lot of innovation that needs to happen there. And it's a slow process, probably slower than anything else, because when we're talking about Web3 and metaverse, this is still new technology, and a lot of R&D and a lot of effort needs to be done, both in terms of maturing the technology, but also testing it on the subject students and doing A/B testing and behavioral science experiments. So there is a need to do that. And what we've done to be able to survive this really harsh environment of trying to get funded before you can scale is jump on commercial opportunities that we could have. And from day one, we were. It's not ideal, but it's the way that my company was able to survive to get us to now we're approaching our Series A, was get some angel investment money, bootstrap, put some of your own money into it, and then looking at commercializing whatever stage you have of the product. And it really helped us find that product market fit. So it was, for us, it's been 5 years now. It was a very long and strenuous process, but it got us to a point where we feel we have a better product market fit.
I want to try to help sort of facilitate this conversation between the money side and the entrepreneur side. Hani, from your point of view, what do you think could change about that conversation? When you talk to investors, what are some questions you think they should ask you? And what are some questions that you'd rather not be asked, like that you think are not important that they're asking you?
Yeah. I think the most difficult question is like scalability. Are you ready to scale? What is the number of users that you have, et cetera, at a time where you're opening up one category at a time. It's not a traditional business investment, right? Like if you look at the B2C models, e-commerce, et cetera, you can build an MVP and go to the market and start generating revenue and number of downloads relatively quickly. For Edtech specifically, and when you're talking about virtual reality, immersive Web3 technology, it's a slower process and a better understanding of what it takes to do that, and an understanding for the need and necessity to develop that and approaching it in a different way, whether it's gonna have to come through government funding or grants or directly through investment. There is that need to give time and put money and be willing to allow the entrepreneurs to fail, because like quick failure and learning from it is the best way to get to the results. You cannot innovate without trying and failing.
Badr, what are some ways that you think this conversation between investors and entrepreneurs might change in this space? How would you advise investors to start that conversation? What are some things that you think are important to know and some less important things that they sometimes ask you?
I think it's about education. So we're in the context of EdTech, I think it requires a lot of education on both sides. So we need to, as founders, we need to educate the investors and the VCs about the opportunities. And we need to spend much more time doing so, right? I think the other industries, including fintech and others that have gotten a bigger portion of the investment, have done a great deal in kind of educating, and it's much, the results are much easier to kind of measure. For us, it's like, how do you put a dollar sign on human development, right? And some research that was done in the U.S. found out that $1 spent in, for example, education, specifically in early childhood development, can result in $17 return back on society. So 17x, right? Now that's language VCs understand, right? And then we take that and we look at the direct return, IRR, and all of these things. So I think we have, as a society of founders and the research man and the data man, MAGNiTT, a fantastic platform that brings visibility to the ecosystem. We have a role to play in educating the investors. That's one side. The second side, you asked about the investors' mindset. So I think the investors need to be a bit more open-minded about it. MEVP, when they invested with us very early on, they took a leap of faith. Everyone was saying, oh, EdTech, no, that requires very, very patient capital. MEVP and some other leading founders and VCs in the region decided to listen and hear the story. And I think they need to be more. So it's about dialogue, it's about education both ways, and about having patience. And again, as I said, if we don't develop this sector holistically, I believe there are no other sectors, right? Because if we, it's the foundation. And then if we try to just look at user economics, we keep looking at, sorry, this is just a little bit technical in terms of investments. If we look at unit economics, you usually look at the fragmented unit economics, the isolated ones. But I would encourage us to look at a more holistic approach, right? So I see in the room a few EdTech startups, Inglis, look at my unit economics, add it to his unit economics, and look at the lifelong value of a learner. And you'll see tremendous value in that, instead of just trying to look at mine. So I see a massive opportunity with tapping into these universes, because as I said, one of the things that we have done, as I said earlier, is because we didn't have a platform to sit on top of and distribute and grow, we had to build our own universes, which is expensive, right? It was very expensive. So I think it's time to tap into these universes that each one of us created separately.
Rabih, do you agree with this idea of being more patient and perhaps being a little more open to failure? How does that sound to you? It
doesn't sound great.
To an investor.
It doesn't sound great. First, none of our companies fail. I'm joking, of course. Our investment horizon is dictated by our investors. We do not dictate how long our funds are. Our investors, what attract our funds, dictate that, unfortunately. And obviously, we have failures, and we focus on sectors where we had some success earlier on, or we have some expertise. Just let me give you a framework, because we've been focusing a lot on the capital available for Edtech, but again, the product perspective. We at MEVP see per month around 100 transactions. People show us, we have organic, we have, out of these 100, we might not see one Edtech opportunity per month. So in a year, we'll see 1,200, we might see maybe 2, 3 Edtech opportunities. There's a paucity of opportunities. It's amazing, and a very important, as Badr said, in a very important sector. Now, again, I go back to this unique sector where the public sector has a big role. And I think there has to be a public sector VC, if I can coin that term, that can support us as they support schools, right? And a public sector VC can be maybe a bit neutral, set platforms, set longer horizons.
Yeah.
So we can come in our expertise and building companies quickly and cross-pollinate from our other successes.
Yeah. But that kind of a VC would be very interested in the societal outcomes.
Yes. And the intangibles and the multiplier effect in the economy,
Yeah.
and preparing the new generation of young people for future jobs.
Philip, how would you sort of help ease this conversation between entrepreneurs in the edtech space and venture capitalists?
I'm going to summarize it going back to what I said earlier. It goes down to risk appetite, ultimately. And if you acknowledge, as what Rabih is saying, that the VC, at least community here, aren't necessarily focused on the segment because the risk associated with it isn't appealing, then you actually need to flip it on its head and put the work on the founders to identify and do their due diligence on where you can find this type of capital. So, number one, I believe any founder would like to have revenue over venture capital, because ultimately they don't need to be diluted. So that's an open challenge to any of the institutions that may be interested in the type of companies that are being created to embrace them and provide them with the projects that actually make them more sustainable than having to take venture capital. The second, as I mentioned, there is a role of government. I don't know that my opinion is that government should be investing directly, but what you're beginning to see is fund of funds, whereby they can support by basically de-risking some of the funders themselves to make those investment capital with a mandate for education. The third is that CVC are more patient capital than potentially traditional LPGP VCs. And therefore, when you're looking at some of the technology companies themselves that want to embrace the size of the education market, there is an opportunity for CVCs and large corporates, specifically in the technology space, to invest in education themselves with slightly more patient capital. And the final one is that clearly it's an industry that requires research and development. And that is a role where government, with the council that's been set up here, can focus on the role of education. If I just looked at MAGNiTT before coming in, 95% of the capital has gone to e-learning platforms. It's one segment within education. If you would like to see other edtech companies come and be developed, there is a requirement to effectively train, educate, and invest from a research and development perspective that makes it more appealing for the traditional VCs.
Great point. Thank you, Philip. That's about all the time we have for this conversation. It's been really fascinating. Badr, I think you have one final point you'd like to make?
So, I'd just like to call for a suggestion saying, can we start doing, just to pick up on Philip's note, can we start doing a research together with the government? Can we partner on test beds or sandboxes? Now, in all other sectors, we have sandboxes associated to the regulators. It'll be really, really great to start seeing research and allow the private and edtech companies to come in and partner with the government at a sandbox level, test things, look at the efficacy, look at the impact, and if something works, we can then take it and scale it at large.
So the big takeaway here is more government involvement early on would help a lot of these.
And the private sector is ready. We can bring in some really important contribution from other sectors that can really help edtech sort of education digitize. There have been laggards, if you want, in a very sophisticated, very advanced society like the UAE, without generalizing across other countries.
Well, all of you, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.